talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Good evening and welcome to Vote 2024, The People's Decide with me, Camilla Tominey. Coming up on tonight's show, we will of course bring you all of the highlights of an extraordinary commemoration of the 80th anniversary of D-Day. We're also going to be speaking about murderers being given tougher sentences. That's the new announcement from the Conservative Party. And we'll be talking about a very moving video that's been recorded by Lib Dem leader Ed Davey and talking about carers and caring. But first, here's the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Camilla, thank you and good evening to you. Well, indeed, world leaders, including Volodymyr Zelensky, Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron, have all joined His Majesty the King and Prince William at the final event to commemorate the D-Day landings in Normandy in France. They've been paying tribute to those who took part in the operation on the beaches of Normandy exactly 80 years ago. The US president took aim at Vladimir Putin in his speech earlier, comparing the events of the Second World War to the situation between Russia and Ukraine currently. Meanwhile, King Charles thanked those who'd made it home for their bravery and sacrifice alongside their perished colleagues.
It is with the most profound sense of gratitude that we remember them and all those who served at that critical time. We recall the lesson that comes to us again and again across the decades. Free nations must stand together to oppose tyranny.
And from those international commemorations held at Omaha Beach in Normandy on the coastline of France, here in the UK, commemorations have also been taking place right across the UK. Let's start with Lisbon in Northern Ireland, where the local town crier delivered a D-Day proclamation early on. Scunthorpe marked the anniversary of the largest seaborne invasion in military history with their march past. And there is a beacon lighting ceremony taking place in Kent tonight across the county. In London today, the Princess Royal joined Chelsea pensioners at the Royal Chelsea Hospital in London for D-Day commemorations there. And a remembrance service taking place in Worksop in Nottinghamshire today, with wreaths laid for the fallen. Well, in news away from those commemorations, around 80 migrants were rescued after their boat got into difficulty crossing the English Channel this morning. Among those brought ashore were 3 children, including a baby. The Coast Guard, lifeboats and Border Force conducted the rescue off the Kent coast. That operation has now concluded, with an RNI spokesman confirming all people have been accounted for and are back on land. In news breaking this evening, Prince Harry's been given the green light to appeal a High Court ruling over the police protection he receives within the UK. Earlier this year, the Duke of Sussex lost his legal challenge against a Home Office decision to change his level of personal security when he visits. His lawyers argued he was singled out, but the High Court said there'd been no procedural unfairness at all. A body's been found in the search for a toddler who fell into the River Soar in Leicester in February. A search was launched to find 2-year-old Xylo Mariziva after he went into the water at Aylestone Meadows. Officers have thanked everyone involved in finding him and are now supporting his family. Now, at least 37 people have been admitted to hospital today after a sudden wave of E. coli infections. The UK Health Security Agency mysteriously saying most of the cases reported across the country are part of, and I quote, a single outbreak because of a single item of food. And because of the wide geographic spread, experts believe it is linked to one food item distributed nationally. No clue yet, though, what that food item is. And a major search operation's underway on the Greek island of Symi after TV doctor Michael Mosley went missing. It's understood he was on a walk, but he didn't return to his accommodation. The 67-year-old is known for appearing on daytime programmes like This Morning and The One Show. An appeal has been launched, urging anyone who spots him to get in touch with local police. Those are the latest news stories. Do sign up to GB News Alerts, scan the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thanks, Polly. Welcome back. Well, look, if you, like me, have been working today and perhaps you haven't been able to catch up with everything that's been going on in Normandy, we brought you news of the D-Day commemorations from Portsmouth yesterday. There were some very, very moving scenes in France this morning. As you'd imagine, the pomp and pageantry of a military ceremony once again played out before veterans. So we just wanted to take you through every step of the day, really, so you can catch up on some of the highlights. The day started with a military piper, Major Trevor Macy Lilly, who came into shore on a DUKW amphibious vehicle ahead of playing a dawn lament on Gold Beach in Arromanches in Normandy at the exact moment of the invasion, 7:25 a.m. local time. Rishi Sunak, of course, arrived with his wife and gave this speech.
Each of you who contributed that day, sailor, soldier, aviator, civilian, whether you fought on the beaches or parachuted from the skies or flew fighters or gliders, whether you were an engineer or a radio operator or an intelligence officer, your actions freed a continent and built a better world.
The general election campaign was very much put on the back burner. Of course, Labour leader Keir Starmer was also in attendance, and here's what he said.
The message to the veterans is thank you. Thank you for all of us who have had the freedom that they fought for so courageously as individuals and as a group, and to say thank you through them to those that never made it back, but also to say that we know that it is our duty as they get older to continue to tell the story, to make sure the history is told.
Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey was in Chippenham this morning at an event to mark D-Day. Here was his tribute.
It's critical we remember them and that we pass that memory on to our children and young people. It was a most important moment in our country's history and I think the world's history. It was a fight for freedom, a fight for democracy. If those brave men and women hadn't fought that day and gone onto those beaches, we might not be having the election at the moment. We might not have the freedoms we enjoy. That's how important it is. And so we must remember them and thank them.
The King and Queen attended the UK's national commemoration event at the British Normandy Memorial in Vers-sur-Mer. He paid tribute to the remarkable wartime generation as he gave this speech.
It is with the most profound sense of gratitude that we remember them and all those who served at that critical time. We recall the lesson that comes to us again and again across the decades. Free nations must stand together to oppose tyranny.
Prince William, the Prince of Wales, joined Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the country's commemorative ceremony on Juno Beach. The Prince of Wales spoke of the continued bond between Canada and the UK.
I'm honoured to join you to commemorate the bravery and sacrifice of the Canadian troops who gave so much 80 years ago. On June the 6th, 1944, as part of the 150,000 Allied troops that landed or parachuted into Normandy, 14,000 were from Canada. Far from home, they stormed these very sand dunes behind me, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of British troops.
French President Emmanuel Macron awarded the Légion d'honneur to US veterans at a joint ceremony with Joe Biden at the Normandy American Cemetery. There, the US president made an impassioned call for the defence of freedom and democracy.
The Allied forces of D-Day did their duty. Now the question for us is, in our hour of trial, will we do ours? We're living in a time when democracy is more at risk across the world than any point since the end of World War II, since these beaches were stormed in 1944.
So I'm asking you quite a simple question tonight. How have these commemorations made you feel? We've seen veterans there wiping their eyes. It's been emotional, it's been heartfelt. What's your reaction to the commemorations both in Portsmouth and in Normandy today? Let me know the emotion that it's tugged in you and how it's made you feel to be British. Get your views in at gbnews.com/your say, and I'll be reading some of those out a little later. Well, in Normandy for us was our reporter Sophie Reaper. Here's what she's been up to today.
We are on Gold Beach, where there are hundreds of other vehicles like this, and I think we can now go for a little bit of a drive. If we can, off we go. Now, we're on Gold Beach, and of course this is an incredibly important day. It's an incredibly important anniversary, but it's also about celebrating.
Well, let's return to Gold Beach now in Normandy and speak to our reporter Sophie. I mean, thank goodness the sun shone, Sophie. I can hear there is still music playing in the background. The crowds have gathered. It must have been quite a spectacle for you today.
It absolutely has been, Camilla, and I think this entire week has really been truly an incredibly moving experience, but also just one that I think both myself and our team will just never forget. Of course, you saw that in the Jeep. What an amazing experience to be doing that here on Gold Beach on such a historic day. But there's been so many memorable moments. Today we had the Veterans commemorative parade on the square just above me, where you can hear the music is coming from. That is Parade Square in Arromanches. You can see on the left is the D-Day Museum. In that square today, we had that commemorative parade. We heard bagpipe music. We saw those veterans that have been brought over from the UK by the Royal British Legion. They were greeted, they were given rounds of applause. We heard the last post, and I think most memorably at the end, all of the veterans, those who were able to, stood and crossed arms and sang Auld Lang Syne. It was absolutely amazing. And I also have to say, I was very fortunate enough to speak to one of the veterans from my home patch in the northwest, Bernard Morgan, a really incredible man, 100 years old. He landed on D-Day all those 80 years ago. He was the youngest sergeant in the RAF to do so, and a truly incredible man. And I always find it really, really moving whenever I get to speak to him. We were also greeted by royalty today. Prince William was here in Parade Square. He paid us a visit to say thank you and show his respect to some of the veterans that were there in Parade Square. We then all moved down to Gold Beach, and I think you can still see there's quite a bit of activity going on here. It has quietened down now a little bit as the sun just starts to set over on my left-hand side, over the coastline where you would find Omaha and Utah Beach. But there is still plenty of activity, people out still showing their respect, their commemorations. In the last hour, we saw the parachute regiment deploy and land here on Gold Beach, and that was really, really incredible, especially the moment where they landed with a huge Union Jack flag. That was met with incredible rounds of applause. I think I'm really proud to be here today, and it's just been so amazing to speak to people, hear veteran stories, and also hear why other people wanted to come along. People have flown from all over the world, especially the UK. They're the people we've been speaking to and hearing about why they wanted to come and pay their respects, because of course we are 80 years since D-Day, but that doesn't matter. We should still always remember.
Absolutely, Sophie. You've done an extraordinary job there, and I know you've been very moved and touched by what you've been seeing and the people that you've been meeting. And as you say, of course, it's got added poignancy. We're at 80 years now. There are a few veterans there. The next big commemoration is going to be very different. So it's so important, isn't it, just to mark this moment and get these memories, collate these memories. We must never forget. It's so important as well that I know you've seen quite a lot of children there. We had Ellie Costello, she'd met some children in Normandy earlier on in the week. So good to have the younger generation invested in this as much as those veterans and their families.
Absolutely, and we actually spoke to a couple of children earlier who had the opportunity to meet King Charles and Queen Camilla earlier today, and I think most memorably, the little girl, only 7 years old, told me that this is the best day of her life and that she'll always remember it. And I think that is a key part of the education, getting these children, the younger generations, involved to make sure, as you say, there are not many veterans left now. When we've spoken to people this week who've been coming for years, perhaps at the 60th, the 70th, the 75th anniversary, they talk of how the numbers have dwindled over the years, and that now, as you say, it's so important that we hear those stories and that we pass that legacy on to the younger generations to make sure that they are forever commemorated.
All right, Sophie Reaper, thank you very much for your efforts there, reporting for GB News all week. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, commemorations, of course, took place across the UK. They took place in Scunthorpe, and we're just seeing pictures of that now. There are also a memorial held at the Yorkshire Air Museum. You can see veterans there now, and again, young people mixing with old. This was a cross-generational remembrance today. Also Reading, where crowds gathered to watch the ceremony unfold in Normandy on big screens, seeing a wreath laying there. Worksop, again, saw aircraft fly overhead, crowds gathering once more, and of course at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, where literally 1,000 gathered to remember those who sacrificed so much. There was also an event at the Royal Hospital Chelsea's Founders' Day, where Princess Anne was paid tribute to British D-Day veterans, telling one that he was the reason she performed her public role. Anne met the former servicemen as they gathered in Normandy to remember the fallen colleagues and their own efforts ahead of the 80th anniversary of the Second World War campaign to liberate Europe from Nazi rule. She joined veterans and their families at that event, held by the Royal British Legion. Well, in just a moment, we're going to be discussing the significance of D-Day with a historian. And just getting into exactly the sacrifices that were made, because when you look back at the timetable and how, frankly, frightening it must have been, particularly for some of those very young soldiers who were coming off the boats and onto the beaches, and they were just in their teens, it's astonishing. So we'll cover the historic side in just a moment. But let's speak to our reporter, Will Hollis, who's in Derby. Will, I can hear the bells are ringing, and I think they're ringing for some time into the night. Tell us a little bit about the character of the UK commemorations.
Good evening, Camilla. Yes, well, a short service has just finished here at Derby Cathedral, but the bell ringing, that has only just started, and I'm told that the bell ringers here at Derby Cathedral are going to be doing so for 3 hours, no more, no less, in honour of the men that sacrificed their lives and the ones that came home and have to live with the effects of the Normandy landings 80 years ago. There are big events like this one here in Derby where you would struggle to get a seat at those commemorations, as well as smaller events, hundreds of them up and down the country, in villages and towns. And I've been speaking to people about why it is so important that while we're looking at Normandy, while we're looking at Portsmouth and the National Arboretum, that the people who gave their lives are remembered in the places where they're from as well, because it's those places that they never had the joy to return to in peacetime. And in Worksop, I was speaking to the Lord Lieutenant of Nottinghamshire, Veronica Pickering, about why it is just so important to celebrate not just here, but elsewhere in the UK.
This is where most of those young men and women came from. The small towns and villages across the UK represented all of us. It wasn't one army from a small place or one large town and one large city. These small towns, and in fact most of the working people in these small towns, are the ones who went over to Normandy, are the ones who fought in the First and Second World Wars. This is where our history sits, this is where our history belongs, and it should be shared.
Music has played such a big part of these commemorations, whether it's the bells here in Derby, pipers playing at services around the country and world, as well as the last post that we've heard in so many different services. Where are we going to now? Well, the services haven't ended at 9:15 around the country and around the world. Beacons will be lit in memory of the men that died 80 years ago.
Will Hollis, thank you very much indeed for that report from bell ringing in the background, but it sounds glorious. Derby, thank you so much. As I said, we're going to have a look at D-Day next from a historical perspective. Why was it so significant? Stay tuned for that.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Isabel Webster. Thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
In places like News Corp, right, an organisation I know reasonably well, when that poor guy died in America,
George Floyd, you're talking about?
Yes, they had a 9-minute silence for him, right? A more absurd and ridiculous idea I'd never come across in my life. How do you feel about 9 minutes for George Floyd?
Well, of course, that's the length of time that he was strangled by a police officer.
I know why it was, but how do you feel about that?
Well, I think a lot of the black staff, in particular in News Corp, probably appreciated the fact that it was taking a stand. And if you look at business...
Why do they need to take a stand about what the police do in the United States?
OK, well, what about the guy... What about the jeweller tonight who has died in Richmond in Surrey when two, how should we put them, hoodlums of colour actually had a chokehold? He went home and he killed himself. There are lots of things going on in our world, as you well know, which are very upsetting. OK. And if we're going to stop every time that somebody dies in unfortunate circumstances, we'll never get any work done.
Well, Stella, a final word to you.
I think sometimes, yes, equality and diversity can be a waste of money when it goes to things that are not necessary for the function of the organisation. But when just last year you had Birmingham Council being pushed into bankruptcy because they were found out to not have given women equal wages.
No,
then
because they paid bin men more than they paid cooks.
But then you can see Ben's point that if they had someone who was looking appropriately in equality and diversity and the actual practical policy implications of what they were doing, then maybe you wouldn't have this situation. You wouldn't have this legal liability. That's what Ben is saying. This is a multi-million pounds organisation. Like, it needs to have someone looking seriously and taking responsibility for these decisions.
The People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. GB News, Britain's election channel.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes. Thank you for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024 with me, Camilla Tominey. Joining me now in the studio is military historian Peter Caddick-Adams. Peter, you wrote an 800-page book, Sand and Steel, on D-Day alone, which pretty much sums up the significance. I mean, can you just talk us through why the events of June the 6th, 1944 were so remarkable?
June the 6th was the tip of the iceberg, really, so it's the beginning of the end. It's when we land 156,000 people on the French shores. But that's just the beginning. And they then battle all the way through to Germany, which takes another 11 months. And that's VE Day, which we'll be celebrating next year. But it's also the birth of things like coalitions, because no one nation is strong enough to undertake a sort of battle against the Germans on their own, not even the United States. So this is America, Canada and Great Britain, plus a lot of other coalition partners as well, like the Free French, the Free Poles. Later on, there are Czechs, Belgians, Dutch, you name it. And the strength is in the coalition, but D-Day is just primarily Britain, France, America and Canada, landing that huge number of people, overwhelming the Germans in the first few days, and then being able to fight into France, liberate France, and then eventually up to the German border.
I mean, how risky was it as a military strategy at the time? Obviously, it required a huge amount of planning and cooperation between different Allied forces. There were 10,000 casualties on the day. It was expected that there would be more, Peter, not to lessen how catastrophic it was for the military forces. I mean, this was an extraordinary risk that had to be timed according to weather, had to be timed according to tidal patterns.
Well, a landing on an opposed enemy coast is the most difficult military operation, never mind tying in paratroop landings at night. And that's because you're not just battling the Germans, you're battling the weather. And on the 5th of June, we had to postpone D-Day by 24 hours anyway because the weather was too bad. The Great Armada crosses the Channel in barely adequate conditions. And so tying all of that together proved a real challenge, but we just about got it right.
But crossing the Channel in those days was no mean feat in itself. And you've got some very, very young soldiers. I read some testimony today. You know, some of these D-Day veterans, they hadn't been on the sea before. They hadn't ever seen a beach.
Most people are born between 1919 and 1923, so it's that sort of age group who are 18, 19, 20 in 1944. When you ask them if they were heroes, they say no. Everybody in my year group was in uniform and we were all doing something. And I just happened to be in D-Day, but, you know, I didn't do anything special. So, you know, that humility is very humbling. But it means, yes, you're absolutely right. They weren't tank drivers. They weren't riflemen. They weren't landing craft crewmen. They weren't pilots even of aircraft. They all had to be trained. And you asked me earlier about training. That took for the better part of 2 years before D-Day actually sort of materialised.
And also, I mean, we talk about the beaches now, Gold Beach, Juno Beach. This wasn't an operation that happened overnight. It took some days to secure these beaches, and therefore you had Allied troops just under constant enemy fire from above.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to feed in as many troops as possible once you've made those lodgements, and they weren't all joined up together to begin with. That takes sort of several days, and as we know, the Americans had a very sticky time at Omaha Beach. I mean, looking back on it, we now know it was successful, but at the time, the leaders were hugely worried that it would go wrong. Winston Churchill had overseen the Gallipoli operation in 1915 in the First World War. That had ended in disaster. The last Allied landing had been in Italy at Anzio in January 1944. That just degenerated into a stalemate for a long time. The Salerno landings had likewise in southern Italy in September 1943 had nearly been pushed back into the sea. So the Allied experience of landing and fighting the Germans had not been a happy one.
No. When you read that there was a survey conducted in the week, I think it was by YouGov, to suggest that half of young people aged 18 to 34 didn't recognise the term D-Day or what it meant. I mean, are we doing enough to teach children in schools this stuff? I know that the history of Nazi Germany is certainly on the national curriculum. I studied it back in the day, and I know my children are studying it. But are we doing enough about the sort of Allied offensive and the British side of things?
You can never do enough, is the answer. They sit up and take notice when it's relevant. I mean, I come from the Airfix School of Military History, so I was making plastic models, and that's how I taught myself about that sort of era. It wasn't even in the curriculum when I was sort of studying at school. I'm less worried than some people are, because you can put out a questionnaire saying, do you recognise this? Do you know about this? Do you know where Auschwitz is? Do you know what D-Day is? Who is Winston Churchill? And there will always be astonishing numbers of people who don't know. When it's important, it's news programmes like this, documentaries, video streaming, all of those sort of indirect things rather than the direct thing from school that really trigger the interest and get people talking about it. We're talking about it now. So D-Day will be a popular subject. And school trips, we never used to have those.
No, that's true. I've had one of my children has gone out there to the beaches and very affected by it. I just think that that survey seems to have struck a chord, and it's been disappointing to people. But as you say, I mean, if we forget our history or indeed rewrite it, then we're doomed to repeat it. That's the problem, Peter.
Yeah. So I mean, so the questionnaires come and they go. I'm less worried, and I'm quite sanguine that the future generation will know and understand. And that's the point of this commemoration. We're saying goodbye to the old generation because they won't be around for much longer. And have you noticed how many school children are involved?
Yeah. I mean, I said that to Sophie Reaper, who's in Normandy.
Yeah,
There's
exactly,
lots of children there, and that's very encouraging to see.
So that's we're handing the torch to them. It'll be their job soon.
Peter, thank you very much indeed
Thank
for
you very
joining
much.
me this evening. Well, let's get some of your reaction. I asked you earlier, how are the commemorations making you feel? What's your very emotional reaction to the events that you've witnessed, not just in Portsmouth yesterday, but in Normandy today? Philip says, it brings a tear to my eye to see that those brave young men's sacrifice was in vain. Malcolm says, today is a reminder that the free world has to stand up to tyranny and we must defeat the dictators at all costs. I think that very much echoes actually what both Rishi Sunak and indeed Joe Biden said today. David says, I find it very emotional. I was only 3 years old, now 83. Mel says, a reminder of those that fought for us and died for us. We have to thank them, and we often take for granted the freedoms we have today. Well said. Well, I hope you've been able to take in and perhaps catch up on what's been going on in Normandy today. Of course, you can check out the new GB News website because we've got lots more coverage there. And the events go into the night, so we'll be continuing to watch what's unfolding in Normandy later. Coming up next, we're going to be discussing whether murderers should be given tougher sentences. That's Rishi Sunak's plan. Some may think this is a little, too late. Stay tuned for that.
Hello and welcome to your evening GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So some rain and showers around, particularly for northern areas tonight, but clear spells as well. We've still got low pressure up to the north of the UK, bringing various secluded fronts across the UK as we go throughout the rest of this evening. But looking at the detail, any showers across England and Wales will slowly fizzle out this evening, leaving plenty of clear spells. That's going to help those temperatures drop into the low single figures, and we could even see a touch of grass frost in some rural spots tonight. Across northwest Scotland, though, there's a band of heavy rain making its way southeastwards as we go into the early hours of Friday. And along with this, we will see some quite strong blustery winds. So it'll make for quite a wet commute across much of Scotland on Friday morning, with that heavy rain making its way southeastwards, feeling pretty chilly in those blustery winds as well. As we look further south, we have got some clearer skies to start the day, so some brightness, particularly further south across southeast England, but also a few showers, particularly across the southwest, and they will make their way southeastwards as we go through Friday morning. That band of rain across Scotland will also make its way southeastwards into England as we go into Friday afternoon, fizzling out a little bit and just breaking up into showers as it makes its way southeastwards, but introducing a bit more in the way of cloud into parts of England and Wales. Heavy and frequent showers, though, developing behind this across northwest Scotland. We could see a bit of hail and the odd rumble of thunder in those, but feeling pretty pleasant further south with highs of 18 to 20. Now, if we look at what this weekend has to bring, a bit more in the way of cloud to start the weekend on Saturday compared to what we're going to see on Friday morning. It's not quite as chilly a start. A few showers to start the day, but generally clearing away to the southeast into the early afternoon, and further frequent heavy showers across Scotland, and that will continue throughout the weekend, but some uncertainty as we head into the new week.
This is GB News and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but actually it's about you.
And we won't forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
More than ever, it's important to hear
all sides
as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Vote 2024 with me, Camilla Tominey. Let's talk about crime and punishment now. The manifestos haven't come out yet, that's next week, but we've got a taster of what might be in the Tory manifesto. Rishi Sunak is planning to pledge a massive overhaul of homicide laws, which will see longer sentences imposed on domestic abusers and could lead to a US-style system of first and second degree murder. Minimum sentences for murders which take place in the home will increase from 15 to 25 years. And the Prime Minister will also pledge a review of the current distinction between manslaughter and murder, which could lead to more killers being convicted of the more serious crime. To discuss this is lawyer and legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg, KC. Lovely to see you this evening, Mr. Rosenberg. Lovely to see you. Thank you for joining me. What's your reaction to this? Because I must admit, I read it and sort of scratched my head. So we've got a system where prisons are overcrowded, in fact, so overcrowded that the former Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, is having to release prisoners early. We've also got a court system that doesn't seem to have caught up with the COVID backlog. And now Rishi Sunak is pledging to put people in prison for even longer. I mean, I can understand why victims and their family would welcome this, but is it practical?
If you're a politician and you're increasing sentences, you know that you won't be around, and I'm not talking about the impending election, you won't be around when the additional sentence is served in 10 or 20 years' time. And maybe they'll have sorted out the prisons by then, although don't hold your breath. The real question is whether an increased minimum term is going to make any difference. Is it going to deter somebody from killing if they think they're going to get a minimum term of around 25 years instead of a minimum term of 15 years? Don't forget, if you're convicted of murder, you have to be sentenced to imprisonment for life, and we're talking about the time when you're considered for parole. Do murderers think about that? I wonder.
I mean, I think from the public's perspective, there's always been this case for saying life should mean life. And anyone in the legal professions knows that it doesn't. It doesn't mean that you're banged up behind bars for the rest of your life. As you say, there are minimum terms you have to serve, and then you're considered for parole. I'm wondering whether you think in general, however, that actually those life terms for murder are too low. I mean, 25 years sounds to me to be fairer than, say, 15. You've taken somebody's life in cold blood, and you might be considered for release after just 15 years? Doesn't strike me as enough, Joshua.
That's a perfectly fair position. The question, however, is what happens if you commit 2 murders, 3 murders, a terrorist attack, 10 people are killed, 20 people, 50. We do have an increasing number of people who are given what's called a whole life term. Then, of course, they have very little incentive. Nothing to stop them killing another prisoner, nothing to stop them killing a prison officer. They're not going to spend any more time in prison. And if you give the maximum possible sentence for a relatively small number of killings, what do you do for a terrorist?
Yes. Do you think that the distinction that he's now trying to draw and to make the law clearer on manslaughter and murder is perhaps in response to the case of Valdo Callacane, the Nottinghamshire killer, who the family of the victims, or the families of the victims, the 3 victims, the 2 students and then the older gentleman, they were saying that they had no idea that it was going to be a manslaughter charge and not a murder one. And they felt very disappointed that as a consequence, and yes, it was decided that Callacane had mental health problems, and it was decided that, you know, his mental health had affected his behaviour, but they felt very disappointed by the sentence he received. And indeed, we read this week that there aren't enough psychiatric prison places either.
There are major problems, as you say, in the whole prison estate. I think they were upset. I don't think that and this is what the subsequent inquiry has established, I don't think they were kept fully informed by the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, in terms of the sentence, I strongly suspect that Callacane will die in prison or in the mental hospital, high-security hospital that he's been sent to. He's very ill, and it doesn't look to me as if he's going to be released anytime soon. The situation is that he can only be released if the Justice Secretary or a court called the First Tribunal concludes that he no longer poses a risk to the public, and it's pretty unlikely that that will happen. But what the family are understandably concerned about is that he was convicted, as you say, of manslaughter rather than murder. Now, Now, manslaughter is less serious than murder. If you're convicted of manslaughter, you don't have to receive a life sentence. If you're convicted of murder, you do. And what the Law Commission, the independent body that advises the government on reform of the law, recommended as long ago as 2006 is this reorganization that Rishi Sunak seems to be talking about at the moment. There would be first-degree murder, that's unlawful killings with an intention to kill or cause really serious harm, that's murder as it is at the moment. Then there would be second-degree murder, unlawful killings with an intent to cause serious harm, with an intent to cause injury or fear or risk of injury. And this is where Callaghan comes into the story, cases which would otherwise be first-degree murder, but for the fact that the accused successfully pleads provocation, diminished responsibility, or that this was a suicide pact, and that reduces murder to manslaughter. And then there would still be manslaughter, but that would be confined to killings caused by acts of gross negligence, or perhaps by a criminal act that was intended to cause injury, or a criminal act foreseen as involving a serious risk of some injury. So this would be a reorganization. You would have more people convicted of murder and fewer people convicted of manslaughter.
Joshua Rosenberg, thank you very much indeed for sharing your wisdom and experience on legal matters this evening. Great to have you. Well, let's talk about the European elections now, because 27 countries will vote from the 6th to the 9th of June in elections that will, of course, have a great impact across the European Union and beyond. We've got about 373 million voters eligible to vote from Finland to Belgium, right across the EU. However, what's at stake is the makeup of the European Parliament as ever, but national conservatism is on the rise. We've had Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom topping the polls in Holland. We've had Marine Le Pen once again gaining support in France in recent months. And also, of course, we've had the election of right-wing rulers, Giorgia Meloni in Italy and indeed Viktor Orban in Hungary. So to discuss this, let's talk to Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe. Lovely to see you this evening. Thank you for joining me, Anand. I mean, it is slightly ironic, isn't it, that we seem to be going in a leftwards direction if the polls are to be believed, and yet there is this rise in, some might call it far-right, some might call it right-wing, some might call it populist politics across Europe.
I mean, yes, we do expect the right to do well in the European Parliament elections, but I'd just add a note of caution. In the last Spanish elections, for instance, the Vox Party hemorrhaged a lot of votes to the centre-right. In Poland, what we've seen is a more centrist party take over the government after a long period of government by the far right. So whilst you're right, I think the numbers of right-wing party MEPs in the European Parliament is set to increase. It's a little bit messier than that. It's not across the whole of Europe in a uniform manner.
But at the same time, what do we think is responsible for this kind of rise? Because obviously the I word, immigration, has come up a lot, not just in the UK when it comes to our elections here, but equally across the EU. I mean, immigration is playing a part, I think, in the surge in popularity of characters like Wilders.
Oh, absolutely. Immigration is one of the key factors. You can layer onto that because Geert Wilders has been very good at weaponizing the state of the Dutch economy. So, you know, he majored on the fact that young people in the Netherlands can't get houses, and he tried to offer something on that. So it's a mixture of the economy and immigration. And I think more broadly, a sense of insecurity. We're living in very troubled times. There are a lot of conflicts out there in the world. You've got what's going on in Ukraine. And I just think people feel insecure. And at moments like that, these parties can seem more tempting than at more stable moments.
And just in terms of personnel at the helm of the EU, Anand, how might this leave Ursula von der Leyen? Is her position in jeopardy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, remember last time her majority in the European Parliament was a whopping 9. And this time she faces real trouble. She's been cozying up to some of the more right-wing leaders like Giorgia Meloni in Italy. The problem is that in so doing, she's spawned threats from the left-wing parties that they will not vote with her if she supports parties on the right. So we'll have to wait and see what the precise result is. That it is far from inconceivable that she doesn't get the parliamentary approval she'll need to continue as Commission President.
And also, finally, Anand, there's been this suggestion that actually Meloni, as you've mentioned there, in Italy, could end up being the kingmaker, or perhaps it should be queenmaker in this case.
She could. Her votes will be absolutely crucial in selecting the new Commission president. The other thing that really matters with these right-wing parties is how effective they are at working together in the European Parliament. Because if they can, they will be one of the biggest blocs, perhaps even bigger than the socialist bloc. The problem is that whilst we lump these parties together as right-wing or far-right, they have very different policy offers on, for instance, Ukraine, on the size of the EU budget, and perhaps unsurprisingly, because they're nationalist parties, they find it very hard to cooperate transnationally. And I think that is always a bit of an Achilles heel for them when it comes to working well in the European Parliament.
Anand Menon, thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening. We'll keep an eye on those elections across the course of the next few days. Thank you. Well, coming up next, have you noticed it's been conspicuous by its absence on the campaign trail so far? Any mention of caring or indeed social care, apart from, to his credit, Sir Ed Davey, who has recorded an extremely moving video about caring not only for his disabled son, John, who's 13, but also remembering caring for his mother when she was terminally ill. We're going to be discussing all that in just a jiffy.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country.
That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
How prevalent is it in those with darker skin, like me?
That's a great question, and it's one that we get a lot. So your skin tone does affect your risk of skin cancer. People at the most risk are people with lighter skin tones, so light-coloured hair and eyes as well, lots of moles and freckles, a history of sunburn or a family history of skin cancer. But people with darker skin tones can still burn and can still get skin cancer. Anybody can get skin cancer. So I would encourage everybody, regardless of your ethnicity or your skin tone, to think really seriously about taking care when it's sunny. That myth that you've mentioned that black people can't get skin cancer is really prevalent, and that's something I want to dispel right now, immediately, because more black people think maybe they can't get skin cancer. That might mean that when they spot something unusual for them, they're less likely to go to the doctor and they're diagnosed later. And when you're diagnosed later, your outcomes do tend to be worse.
So the figures are disturbing that more people are getting skin cancer. But what about outcomes? I mean, if you do get skin cancer, what are your prospects?
So yeah, like you say, this research is a mixed picture. We're seeing incidence, so the number of new cases going up, which is not good news. But there is some good news in that mortality, so whether you're going to die or not, is actually going down. And we think that's partly due to early diagnosis, which I just mentioned is so important. But also research has led to better and kinder treatments, which mean the outcomes are likely to be better. So now, if you're diagnosed at the earliest stage, stage 1, with melanoma, actually around 9 in 10 people will survive their disease for 5 years or more.
The People's Channel. Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark Dolan, and this is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Before we start that conversation about care, let's just take a look at Ed Davey's very moving video.
Right, lunchtime.
What does a typical day look like for you, Ed?
It's busy. A lot depends on what carer help we've got, but I'm always involved in John's care. I like to be the one who gets John up in the morning, so he sees me. I get him up because he can't walk. Come on, my sweetheart. Come on, we're going to have some lunch. We have those little game those games with him because it enables him to speak and to practice communicating. The one thing I think one's got to get over about care and being a carer is you develop amazing relationships. I had an amazing relationship with my mum, my gran, my son. Really special. As I've got older and had all those caring responsibilities, seen life through the eyes of my son, could not be more passionate and determined to sort out caring in this country.
Genuinely touching images there of the Lib Dem leader and his son, John, who is 13 and disabled. Joining me now is Geoffrey Cox, who's the Managing Director of Southern Healthcare. Geoffrey, you'll have seen the video like me, and it highlights, frankly, the often thankless task that's performed by carers across the UK. Many people will be able to resonate with that. Also, Ed Davies spoke about the pressures on him and how isolating it was to look after his mother, who was terminally ill. And yet, at the same time, Geoffrey, we've heard nothing really about social care and care in this election campaign so far. What's your reaction to that?
Well, two things, really. Firstly, Ed Davies' clip was very moving, very powerful, and I think he gets what's needed in principle. But in relation to your point, yes, I'd say there's been a deafening silence around social care in this election campaign, given the critical interdependence between social care and healthcare. I'm quite surprised, particularly after the abandonment of plans from the last administration, which is rather tragic and unfortunate.
Absolutely. We had the Dilnot proposals, didn't we? And at one point, it looked as if the government was going to adopt them. Then COVID happened. I know that COVID had an awful effect on the care sector. I mean, obviously, with people in residential homes getting COVID and dying, but also a phenomenal effect on staff being ill, absences. I mean, the care sector is really struggling, Geoffrey. So you need some guidance. You need to know what the next government wants to do about this issue, regardless of whether it's red or blue.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you go back to the COVID time, it was a particularly challenging time for everybody, but it also, at the same time, it brought out the best in people in social care. I saw some commitment, dedication, selflessness, resilience that was beyond what I could have possibly imagined, and I was quite fearful moving into that pandemic. So I think I've seen something else in the care team, as have a lot of other people in the social care sector altogether. But yes, you're right. We need clear action, decisive action. We need funding. We need workforce planning. We need inter-party working and inter-governmental working with providers and the NHS and local authorities working collaboratively. That's never really happened at all. And until it does, I'm going to go around in circles.
I mean, we've heard all of that with regard to the NHS, and obviously it's the Department for Health and Social Care. Does it sometimes feel, Geoffrey, like social care is a poor relation?
Well, I think a lot of people do say that, and it does feel like that. But I think probably, with credit to the guys who are working, giving their absolute best in the NHS, they probably feel like they're a bit of a poor relation too at the moment. I have a lot of support for the commitment, dedication, extraordinary work that goes on in the NHS. And I think, sadly, also, we have in common that that's completely underfunded, undersupported, underappreciated. So I think that's also another public sector service in crisis. And that healthcare and social care go hand in hand, particularly with a growing, ageing population living longer with more increasingly complex conditions that years ago would have been hospital care. Today, they're in care homes. And it's a particularly complex field. It's more specialised. It's much more professional. These guys who work in social care, they give of themselves physically, emotionally, intellectually, and there's a lot of demands upon them, a lot of regulation, a lot of expectation. That's only going to rise as time goes on.
Geoffrey Cox, thank you so much for joining me this evening. We look forward to at least some guidance in one of the manifestos, hopefully all of the manifestos. Tom Harwood joins me now. State of the Nation is on at 8. What have you got coming up?
A little exclusive for you, not a big part of the show, just thought I'd let GB News viewers know. Keith Vaz, the former Member of Parliament, the former Labour Europe Minister, Well, he resigned as a Member of Parliament after a scandal involving some rent boys was published. He's standing as a candidate this election.
Who for?
The One Leicester Party. It's sort of an independent movement, not for any major party, but his name will be on the ballot paper.
Will it be his name
seat.
or a washing machine repairman called Jim?
It will be Keith Vaz, but very good reference, well remembered.
All right, well, we'll stay tuned for that, Tom. That sounds very, very exciting. Well, as ever, I'm going to be back in this studio on Sunday at 9:30 a.m, where I'll be grilling ministers and shadow ministers. I will then be back next week on Monday at 7 o'clock as normal for Vote 2024. But first of all, here's the weather with Rachel Davis.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello and welcome to your evening GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So some rain and showers around, particularly for northern areas tonight, but clear spells as well. We've still got low pressure up to the north of the UK, bringing various secluded fronts across the UK as we go throughout the rest of this evening. But looking at the detail, any showers across England and Wales will slowly fizzle out this evening, leaving plenty of clear spells. That's going to help those temperatures drop into the low single figures, and we could even see a touch of grass frost in some rural spots tonight. Across northwest Scotland, though, there's a band of heavy rain making its way southeastwards as we go into the early hours of Friday. And along with this, we will see some quite strong blustery winds. So it'll make for quite a wet commute across much of Scotland on Friday morning, with that heavy rain making its way southeastwards, feeling pretty chilly in those blustery winds as well. As we look further south, we have got some clearer skies to start the day, so some brightness, particularly further south across southeast England, but also a few showers, particularly across the southwest, and they will make their way southeastwards as we go through Friday morning. That band of rain across Scotland will also make its way southeastwards into England as we go into Friday afternoon, fizzling out a little bit and just breaking up into showers as it makes its way southeastwards, but introducing a bit more in the way of cloud into parts of England and Wales. Heavy and frequent showers, though, developing behind this across northwest Scotland. We could see a bit of hail and the odd rumble of thunder in those, but feeling pretty pleasant further south with highs of 18 to 20. Now, if we look at what this weekend has to bring, a bit more in the way of cloud to start the weekend on Saturday compared to what we're going to see on Friday morning. It's not quite as chilly a start. A few showers to start the day, but generally clearing away to the southeast into the early afternoon, and further frequent heavy showers across Scotland, and that will continue throughout the weekend, but some uncertainty as we head into the new week.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
We've got summer sewn up with an incredible trio of treats, and you could win them. First, there's a fabulous £15,000 in tax-free cash to ensure this summer is special. What would you spend that on? Next, you'll also receive the latest iPhone 15 and a set of Apple AirPods. And finally, £500 to spend at your favourite UK attraction. Fun in the sun could be on us. For a chance to win the iPhone, treats and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of June. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
This is GB News, and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but it's actually about you.
And we won't ever forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
Now more than ever, it's important to hear
all sides as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country.
That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. This is GB News, Britain's election channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, I'm Tom Harwood, Deputy Political Editor of GB News, bringing you the State of the Nation tonight. Today marks the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and it lived up to the occasion. We have had moving ceremonies, Joe Biden warning that the West would stand up to bullies, Nigel Farage hitting out at Sunak for leaving the commemorations early, and British paratroopers dropping into Normandy, having had their passports checked. Well, we'll be discussing it all and going live to the profound scene at the Bayeux War Cemetery, which contains the graves of nearly 4,000 British troops. But in uncertain times, we'll also be asking the question, if Britain of today, the Britain